Hi everyone, this is a video for your next live lesson on paper 1. This week's work is on the third question on the paper, which is on structure. I'm just going to remind you before we move on though about the different skills on the paper and what we've worked on so far. So question 1 is the simplest one, it's just list 4 things, retrieving information. Question 2 is the analysis of language that we did using the extract on Fahrenheit 451 in the previous week. We're now going to move on to analysing structure, so picking out structural devices, things like cyclical structures, repeated motifs, narrowing perspectives, things like that. And then question 4, which we'll be moving on to next week, is the evaluation of a statement and combining that with some analysis of the writer's methods, whether that's the writer's use of language devices or the writer's use of structural devices. So our learning objective today is to revise and develop my structural analysis skills. Again, this is AO2 because you're analysing the writer's methods, but this time for question 3 we're always focusing on structure devices rather than language devices. It's worth mentioning here that if you mention any language devices in your structural analysis, you won't get any marks for them, the examiner will not credit them. So make sure that you're only talking about the structure, how the text is put together. The essential GCSE skills you need for this week are to be able to identify structural devices and correctly apply terminology, to use the correct terms to label the structural features, select quotations including micro quotations, single words, and write specific detailed analysis about the effect on the reader. And we need to avoid here any vague comments, things like makes it flow, tells us what's happening, draws us in, makes the reader want to read on, because every single text in its opening will intend to make the reader want to read on. Nobody writes a text and thinks, I hope nobody reads this. So those comments are too general, too vague. I could say them about absolutely any text I might read, and so they're unlikely to get any credit beyond grade 2 or grade 3 at the absolute maximum. Okay, so here's the first task for you. This is about structural devices. I want you in the centre of your page to write down in the bubble structure devices and surround that bubble with as many as you can think of. Previously, I mentioned cyclical structure, for instance. That's one structural device. What other devices can you remember? To help you, there are some images here, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of a prompt if you've got stuck. So this one is to do with the focus, the perspective. Look at where the arrows are going. The perspective arrows moving outwards or moving inwards. What do we call that? What could this one represent with the arrows going round in a circle? This one is representing that structure of a story, but look at that peak on the graph. What do we call that peak in any story? This one is to do with questions that might be raised, if you can remember what we call questions that come up as a result of details in a text. This one is to do once again with that story mountain idea, that idea of the graph in terms of the tension. What do we call this part leading up towards that moment of maximum impact and excitement? This one is to do with time. What do we call it when the time goes backwards in a text and returns to a point that we've already seen or that's already taken place? Another reference to time, these are particular words that knit a text together. We call them time somethings, those small words that move us on in terms of time, move us forwards, move us backwards, tell us when things happened. This one is to do with who's telling the story. Look what's in the bubble there. What do we call these when it's the person telling the story or people? This one is to do with speech. Correct term for speech, you might remember. This one is to do with the idea of things being calm or things being chaotic. So one of them, the one with the calm sea on the left, represents the idea that everything is calm. The one with somebody being thrown from the boat in the storm represents the idea that things are thrown into chaos. But we've got a correct structural term to describe that idea of calm, and then when the calm is disrupted. And finally, this last one, where things begin in the middle of action, almost like that blast off moment straight from the beginning, where we're thrown straight into some quite dynamic action in the story. So if you pause now and just take a little bit of time to jot down any you can remember, any you can think of. They might be inspired by those images or they might be totally separate things, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so if you now swap to your red pen, you can update your notes with any that you might have missed. So the first two represent widening perspective and narrowing perspective. This is to do with how a story starts and how it progresses. It either starts on a very narrow detail, like an individual, like a person or an object, and then widens out. Or it might start with a more general scene, a general setting, and then zoom in, narrow in on a particular character or a particular detail. The arrows here represent cyclical structure, like the word cycle, the idea that it starts and finishes in approximately the same place. If you think about Lord of the Flies, the events begin on the island and we end once again back there in the same place. They begin on the beach on the island and then they end at the same place on the beach at the shoreline at the point of being rescued. So then we've got that idea of the cyclical nature of a story. This is the point of the maximum excitement in a story or the maximum tension. We call this the climax at the top of that tension graph there. Questions that might be raised about a text, questions that are left unanswered, are called enigmas. The rising action are the details leading up towards the climax when tension is built. You can call that the rising action. The non-chronological structure where events don't go in the order they occur, but use a flashback or a flash forward is what's being represented here. So we might go back in time or we might flash forward in time. It's very common in films as well, that one. Time connectives are a good structural feature. Things like later that day, 2 hours later, that morning. They help us to flash forwards and backwards in terms of structure. This one with the people here represents narrative perspective. Who is telling the story? Is it first person, I? Is it second person, you? Or is it third person, they? Or the use of a name of a character, like John, for instance. You can also have an omniscient perspective, which is a perspective, almost a godlike perspective, as though the story is being told from some all-knowing onlooker, looking down upon the action. So sometimes you get an omniscient perspective. That just means all-knowing. And then you've got dialogue, so that just means speech. Often used to introduce characters. Some stories might begin with dialogue before explaining who is speaking. Those kind of things are what you can look for, but they're also used to introduce new characters often as well. This one here with the calm seas is equilibrium. If a setting is in a state of calm, or the events are in a state of calm, we've got a status quo, we call that an equilibrium. When that calm is disrupted or when there's a sudden shift and throw into chaos of some kind, we call that disequilibrium. Dis meaning not, so not equilibrium, the opposite of equilibrium, chaos. This one is in media res, in the middle of action. So that means dropping us straight into the middle of action, not explaining who these events are happening to or where we are, but it might begin in the middle of a particularly action-filled event, something like a car crash or a bank robbery or something like that. It might begin in the middle of that action. This one represents the repeated motif. So rather than having repetition or semantic fields, when we're talking about structure, we talk about repeated motifs, repeated ideas or images that keep coming back around again and again. The exposition and the resolution, effectively that's the start and the end. The exposition at the start of a story is where we establish the key details, things like the setting, the characters, the time period, all of those kind of things. The resolution is where those things are drawn to an end and we get a kind of nice conclusion to a story. The kind of traditional happy ever after conclusion might be said to be a resolution. And then finally cliffhanger, where the events stop abruptly and we are left to fill in the gaps about what might have occurred next. Okay, so those are the different devices you might have been aware of. Some of them might be new. Make sure you've updated your notes. Last week we talked about the fact that if you can't find any devices, that can cause a bit of panic, but once again, just like in a language response, you can always use semantic fields, you can always use nouns, verbs and adjectives, you can always say emotive language, you can always talk about imagery. Again, you can do the same here with structural devices, so you can ask yourself certain questions and there will always be an answer to these questions. Is the perspective perspective narrow at the beginning, or is it wide? So does it start on a very particular detail and widen out, or does it begin very wide on a whole scene and then narrow down to a character? It will always be one or the other. It will either start narrow or start wide. So that's something you can analyse, why the writer does that. The next thing is whether it begins in a state of equilibrium, so a state of calm, or disequilibrium. And does this change? Is there a sudden shift from one to the other? Because that again can be a structural feature. If you're really stuck, one of the things that I would definitely encourage you to do anyway is to think about the start, the middle and the end. So the start, how does it begin? Firstly, the text begins with a focus on. In the middle, this changes because we see. And then at the end, how does it close? Is there a link back to the start? Is there a cliffhanger? Finally, the text closes with. So just kind of focusing around the start, something that changes in the middle, and how it ends will always give you a structure. And if you struggle with devices, talk about how the focus shifts to. That is still a device when it shifts from one thing to another. Or you can use your structure words. Things like at the start of the text, as the text develops, the text closes with, this is repeated when, to help you talk about structure rather than slipping into language analysis. So structure analysis words, at the very basic level, everybody needs to make sure they use the text opens with, as the text progresses, the text closes with. Very basic, that's for everybody without fail. But even better might be if we start to use structure analysis words in our explanations as well. The focus shifts to. We are then introduced to. This reminds us of earlier in the text when, later in the text. And then finally, if you want to take this even further with your gold, you might combine this with some changes in effects or structural progressions or use of some micro quotes. So you might say this builds a structural progression from equilibrium to disequilibrium. This builds a cumulative effect of terror in this quote and then this quote and then this quote. So I can do it in a little bit more complex way as I go through. But the ones on the screen there in the dark blue, the text opens with, as the text progresses, the text closes with. Those are your paragraph openers every time, and at the most basic level, the most clear, simple level, those are what we want you to use. So we're going to have a look at an example here by looking at a movie opening analysis. We're going to use the movie Baby Driver. Now, the process as a writer is actually very similar when choosing the opening lines of a novel to the way in which a director might choose the opening scenes of a movie. So they need to decide how to introduce characters and settings, how to zoom and shift to keep readers and viewers interested, how to build tension towards a climax. So now what I'd like you to do is again to pause this clip to view the opening to Baby Driver. You can either type in the YouTube address there that is on your screen, you can click through it on the PowerPoint version of this presentation, or alternatively you can just type in to YouTube Baby Driver opening scene. You need to watch approximately the first 2 minutes. Now I want you to think about what structural choices can you see here? What's the focus on at the beginning? How does it shift? How do we zoom? How is tension being built through the structure? And if you're finding this challenging, keep it simple. What's it like at the start? How does it develop in the middle? And then how does it close at the end? Think of this like in the same way you would a text extract. So pause now and watch that clip to do that activity. When you're ready, we're going to do a bit of analysis then, using some of these terms. Now, I told you that you could analyse a film opening in very much the same way as you analyse a novel opening. So on the screen there, you've got a few words about structure, some structural devices. You've got equilibrium, which we talked about before. You've got setting, shifts, wide, narrows, tension. The only one that might be new is protagonist. A protagonist, which is in the top right-hand corner there, just means the main character. That's all that means. But again, that's a useful term that you might use when you're analysing the exposition of a story. You might be talking about how the protagonist's character is developed at the start. So what I want you to do again is, once again, I want you to pause here and to have a go at filling those gaps with those structural words to see how similar analysis of a movie can be, of moving image can be, to the analysis of a novel opening. Okay, so let's get some answers. The scene opens on a wide perspective, and we are introduced to the initial setting, a bank. The scene is initially in a state of equilibrium as calm people go about their everyday errands and traffic passes by. So at the beginning it's wide, it's very calm, it's an everyday scene of a bank. The focus shifts suddenly to a vehicle as the wheel enters the shop. We can see this is a high-powered vehicle with the word Subaru barely visible on the brake calipers, and the tension begins to increase for the audience. The perspective narrows further to the characters within the vehicle, first with the driver who holds an MP3 player, his finger poised over the dial. This extended focus means we presume this is our main protagonist. This narrow focus moves in turn to each of his passengers. So it pans around the different characters. So we go from the setting, the detail of the car, we zoom a little bit, we shift a little bit, but then we narrow into the car and we see each character in turn. Again, another bit of analysis here, same task. You've got the words dialogue, journey, enigmas, disequilibrium, and alternates, as in varies from one to the other. And again, I want you to have a go, pause here, and fill those gaps once again. They seem at odds with the calm scene in the street, which raises enigmas about their purpose in this place. The focus returns to outside of the vehicle as the passengers exit by several doors, and we go on a journey with them into the bank. This is very common. If you follow a particular character from place to place, talk about why you're going on that journey with that person. Why is the writer emphasizing that person? What do they want you to feel? Is it fear? Is it trepidation? Is it excitement about what they might see next? They move in unison to remind the audience this is a carefully planned mission. The focus returns to the driver in the car, and we observe him as he enjoys the music, dancing in his car. Suddenly, we are thrown into disequilibrium as the calm of the moment is shattered by the dialogue, police sirens, and finally gunfire. And the speed of the action increases rapidly to match the potential danger of the events. The perspective alternates between the driver and the action inside as the events unfold. So that's just a bit of structural analysis to show you that actually it's the exact same principle. The decisions that are being made are the same as the directing decisions that the director will make about the initial opening scenes of a film. The intention is to grab you, to set the scene, to introduce the characters, and in a novel we do the exact same thing. So it's analysing what decisions the author has made, and it might help you actually to picture it. Picture the events almost like a moving image, almost like a trailer or an opening scene as you're reading it that first time. So today's extract that we're going to have a look at is The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Lefteri, and it's about Nuri, who is a beekeeper. He comes from Aleppo. He's married, his wife is an artist. They have been forced to flee from Aleppo, which is a city in Syria, when it becomes destroyed by war. They have to escape, and this is about their journey to Britain and the dangers that they face. And in this opening extract, Nuri is talking about the fact that his wife Afra has been blinded somehow along the journey. The events that she's seen have been so awful, and so we open with a scene of the two of them together in this extract. Now there's just a YouTube clip there, that's just a bit of context for you. It is a BBC report about the refugee crisis in Syria and the war in Syria, just to give you a bit of context about who these people are and why they're refugees in this context. So this is what question 3 will look like. Don't forget there is no language in this question. You need to think about the whole of the source. It's from the opening of a novel. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? Now note this one's from the opening, but sometimes it might be a full short story. Sometimes it might be the middle of a novel. It might be the ending of a novel. You need to work out whereabouts we are in that overall arc from the exposition towards the climax and back to the resolution at the end. And you can tell that if it's the opening, it's likely we're in the exposition. So notice here it says you could write about what the focus is on at the beginning. You could write about what changes, And you can write about anything else as long as it's structural. So don't feel like you have to hit every one of those bullet points, but it even encourages you to say, this is how it opens and this is what changes, which is exactly what we would encourage you to do as well. So you want 3 devices, and when you write these up, you're going to say firstly at the start of the text, as the text progresses, finally at the end of the text. Okay, so this is the extract taken from The Beekeeper of Aleppo. We'll read it first of all in sections, and at each section I want you to think about how it is structured. So in this part in particular, we're going to think about how it opens. Is it narrow or is it wide? What's the focus and why at the beginning? We do not go on a physical journey in this section, but we do go on a journey through something. See if you can recognise what that is that we go on a journey around or that we see different parts of. And how is the wife being introduced here? And why does the writer use this method? So we'll read the extract, and those are the questions I want you to think about. I'm scared of my wife's eyes. She can't see out and no one can see in. Look, they are like stones, grey stones, sea stones. Look at her. Look how she's sitting on the edge of the bed, her nightgown on the floor, rolling Mohammed's marble around in her fingers and waiting for me to dress her. I am taking my time putting on my shirt and trousers because I am so tired of dressing her. Look at the folds of her arm. Look at the folds of her stomach, the colour of desert honey, darker in the creases, and the fine silver lines on the skin of her breasts and the tips of her fingers with the tiny cuts, where the ridges and valley patterns once were stained with blue or yellow or red paint. Her laughter was gold once. You would have seen as well as heard it. Look at her, because I think she is disappearing. I had a night of scattered dreams, she says. They filled the room. Her eyes are fixed a little to the left of me. I feel sick. So this is a moment for you to pause and to reread and think about those questions that are on the right-hand side. So the text opens with the words, I am scared of my wife's eyes. We're narrowed in on those eyes, and those eyes are described in vivid detail, and it's quite a shocking, harrowing image as those eyes are described, and we realise these are people who have been through some extreme trauma. We don't go on a journey physically, but we do go on a journey around the wife's body, as though the husband is trying to look at every single part of her and savour every part of her apart from these blinded, awful eyes. He also returns to this idea of happier memories before bringing us back to the present. The wife is introduced through dialogue, and it's that dialogue that almost shatters his reminiscing, his recollection of his wife in previous times, in earlier times. And so she shatters that with the dialogue. I had a night of scattered dreams, they filled the room. And so the wife is introduced through dialogue. And again, she also seems to reinforce this idea of trauma. But once again, we've got this repeated motif that seems to be going all the way through of her eyes. It starts, my wife's eyes, and we see a return to the eyes throughout the extract. Okay, so the next section of the extract is this one. Again, there'll be some questions that I want you to think about in terms of the structure. What device is used here to take us back in time, and what details are revealed? What do the next few paragraphs focus on? Whose perspective is it? And each section seems to end with a short final sentence. Why? I look at her face, confused. There is still no expression. I don't tell her that I dream only of murder now. Always the same dream. It's me and the man, and I'm holding the bat, and my hand is bleeding. The others aren't there in the dream, and he is on the ground with the trees above him, and he says something that I can't hear. And I have pain, she says. Where? Behind my eyes. Really sharp pain. I kneel down in front of her and look into her eyes. The blank emptiness in them terrifies me. I take my phone out of my pocket, shine the light of the flashlight into them. Her pupils dilate. I put the phone in my pocket and step away from her. She's been worse since we got here. It's like her soul is evaporating. So again, pause. Consider those questions on the right-hand side. Okay, so let's go through this in a bit more detail. So here at the beginning of this section, so previously we've had the memories of his wife's body, the shocking image of the eyes, but here we have a flashback. And the flashback is to a time of trauma, and we get the sense of this kind of post-traumatic effects of the experiences on the man. He's remembering an awful experience where he's dreaming of murder. He's holding a bat in his hand, there is blood. And so we get the sense of some awful trauma that he's been faced, and we keep going backwards and forwards between time. Whenever the husband appears to kind of dwell on a flashback, his flashback seems to be broken by the dialogue from his wife, which brings him back into the present. And so the next few paragraphs focus on her and her perspective, the pain she's suffering, and the fact that she can't see, the fact that she's desperate to see a doctor. And each section seems to end with a short final sentence. It's like her soul is evaporating, her pupils dilate, as though there's a sense of almost kind of finality and a sense of kind of tragedy and giving up from the man, and that's achieved through that very short syntax at the end of each section. So we've got that parataxis as well, which gives that kind of hopeless sense to the way it's being built up as well. Finally, the last couple of sections. Again, question to consider here is, where are we transported to and why in this section? I'm glad Afra can't see this place. She would like the seagulls though, the crazy way they fly. In Aleppo we were far from the sea. I'm sure she would like to see these birds and maybe even the coast, because she was raised by the sea. I am from eastern Aleppo, where the city meets the desert. When we got married and she came to live with me, Afra missed the sea so much that she started to paint water wherever she found it. Throughout the arid plateau region of Syria there are oases and streams and rivers that empty into swamps and small lakes. Before we had Sammy, we would follow the water, and she would paint it in oils. There is one painting of the Keish I wish I could see again. She made the river look like a stormwater drain running through the city park. Afra had this way of seeing truth in landscapes. The measly river in the painting reminded me of a struggle to stay alive. 30 or so kilometres south of Aleppo, the river gives up the struggle of the harsh Syrian steppe and evaporates into the marshes. So again, question there on the right hand side. Where are we transported to and why? And if you've identified here, this is a flashback, once again, you're correct. And again, we've got that juxtaposition between this place, the awful place that they're in now, contrasted against a place that they associate with their past, their home. And so the flashback takes them to happier times and the beauty of home as a contrast to where they are now. The final paragraph is this one. I'm scared of her eyes, but these damp walls and the wires in the ceiling and the billboards, I'm not sure how she would deal with all this if she could see it. How does the text end? What details return from earlier in the text? And once again, well done if you've noticed that we've got that repeated motif of her eyes. We've got a cyclical structure. It starts with, I'm scared of my wife's eyes. She can't see out, nobody can see in. But it ends with the same words, I am scared of her eyes. So it brings it back round to the reality and the trauma that the people have suffered with that cyclical structure. And so the journey ends not in this beautiful place in Aleppo, the place that they have left, but it ends in the here and now, in that squalid room. And so it brings the journey to an end for the reader. They're transported back into the room and back to the reality. So if I wanted to apply that start, middle, end philosophy, I now need to select some quotations. So I would select at the beginning the narrow perspective and the first person. I'm scared of my wife's eyes, she can't see out and no one can see in. Look at her. Now I've taken these as two quotations, and I've taken look at her as a micro quotation, a short quotation that supports the earlier quotation. I could even shorten it right down and say I'm scared of my wife's eyes is all the quotation I'm going to use. But if I want to connect to another part, I'm going to get more marks. So this narrow perspective on the eyes and this first person perspective in the voice of Nuri, I am scared of my wife's eyes, is shocking for the audience. We begin in a state of disequilibrium straight away because we can't understand why somebody would be frightened of somebody's eyes, and we're straight away thrown into a moment of trauma when we realise that this woman has been blinded. This creates enigmas about what has been suffered to blind the man's wife, and we immediately start to ask questions about this. That's the impact. but it establishes the tone of trauma and struggle right from the beginning of the extract. And the first person perspective allows you to empathise with Nuri, and the speaker actually wills you to look at and imagine his wife. He tries to place you in his shoes so you can feel things from the perspective of that narrator and feel the trauma that he feels. As the text develops, we then get the flashback. I dream only of murder now. I'm holding the bat and my hand is bleeding. So we've got that traumatic flashback, but then we've got a pleasant flashback that it's juxtaposed against, which is their flashback to their homeland. So I dream only of murder now establishes that post-traumatic effect of what the man has suffered. It's got connotations of sin and danger. And when he describes it in terms, kind of sensory terms, holding the bat and his hand bleeding, that visceral memory is one that you feel alongside the narrator. He wants you to imagine being hunched over the man yourself. It creates a temporary loss of empathy for the man, actually, because we see him now as a murderer, as somebody cruel. And it juxtaposes quite dramatically the love and care that he's showing to his wife at the beginning, because he's dressing her, he's caring for her, he's trying to protect her from all the awful things that she could see in that room. And there's a hidden dark side that's being hinted at. We've also got, contrasting this though, a flashback to happier times. In Aleppo we were far from the sea, which brings a temporary equilibrium and shows extreme contrast with that place. It creates further enigmas about the purpose of the dangerous journey, because we hear about how wonderful their homeland was and it's being contrasted by this awful place that they are now. So it brings that temporary equilibrium as we daydream back in time with Nuri, but at the same time it reminds us of that huge contrast between those two places. And then at the end we return to the eyes. I'm scared of her eyes, but I'm not sure how she would deal with all of this. So it returns to the repeated motif of the wife's blinded eyes. The cyclical structure emphasises the wife as the man's priority, and he returns to a role as carer. He returns to the honest expressions of the man's emotions, the fact that he's scared of his wife, and that empathy is re-established as we flash back to the present day and the bleak surroundings they are in. And so our story ends with them in that bleak, awful room that they're in, which is so different from home. So that overall is the structure. So those would be my 3 paragraphs. Now, how do I write this up? So this is an 8-mark question. It's on structure. We need 3 devices, so we're going to aim to do this 3 times. We do in peels because we might re-quote detail, but remember we don't need to talk about nouns or verbs or adjectives or semantic fields or anything like that, but we might re-quote detail and link to another quotation if it supports, for instance, a repeated motif or a strengthening of a particular idea or a sudden contrast or disequilibrium from one idea to another. We might use more than one quotation and we might select a single word. So we're going to start with, firstly, at the start of the text, the writer uses, and then we're going to name the structural device. A sense of equilibrium, a sense of disequilibrium, a narrowing perspective, a focus on, the use of enigmas, whatever it might be, that structural device that we've just annotated previously. Then we're going to give a quote from where the device appears. So for instance, the writer begins in a state of disequilibrium. I'm scared of my wife's eyes. That would be your quotation. We then explore the effect of that, like we have done on the previous slides, what it does to the reader, what it makes us think of, what ideas it strengthens, whether it evokes empathy in us, how it connects to other things. And these are just some analytical verbs, and particularly the ones on the right hand side, the structural effect ones are useful. This creates an overall effect of resolution, disruption, finality. This shifts a tone to, this builds a cumulative effect of, this provides an alternative voice from, etc. Micro quotations if relevant, so there might be another quotation that you want to link to, or there might be a word you want to analyse, but remember, no language devices. And then again, I'm going to explore the effects. Now these might be more like PEEs than peels. You might not need to select a micro quote, but if it helps you to create a deeper understanding of the effect, then absolutely do so. You will get more marks as ever for micro quotes, for judiciously selected quotations, single words. And then in your next paragraph you would say, secondly, as the text develops, finally, as the text closes, the writer uses. But I'm going to repeat the same structure 3 times. So you have a go, keep that structure visible, choose one of the quotations that we've annotated earlier on, one of the structural points, or you could even write an entire answer here. In fact, your work for this week is to complete a full answer, but you might choose to do this after the video. For the purposes of the lesson, I want you just to practice one of these structural analysis paragraphs. Okay, when you're ready to unpause and continue, you're then going to do some self-assessment. So the mark scheme is quotations, including micro quotations, structured devices, like those ones that we talked about at the beginning, cyclical structure, repeated motif, narrowing perspective, climax, whatever. You're also going to use structure words. So at the start of the text, as the text develops, we see later. This builds on an earlier idea when, anything that talks about where things appear in the text, and then equally the effect on the reader, what it does to us. Use your red pen, use a key, so you put Q for quotes, SD for devices, SW for structure words, and E for effect on the reader. Tick every time you've hit an area of the mark scheme. This will help you to identify any areas that are missing. And of course, double check for those ideas like we've got on the right hand side. Make sure you haven't written vague things like makes it flow, tells us what is happening, draws us in, makes the reader want to read on, because you won't get any marks for that. And when you're finished, think about giving yourself a mark out of 10 for each area of the criteria there on the right hand side. Are you insecure, or have you got total mastery of identifying devices now? Are you totally secure or insecure in terms of selecting quotations? Are you totally secure or insecure on writing about them and talking about specific effects? Because this will help you to create some specific targets, and you can work on those things for the remainder of the week and practice those skills a little bit further next time. Now, in terms of your home learning this week, you're going to complete a structure analysis question, so 3 PEALs or 3 PEEs based on this extract and the question we've prepared today. You'll need to go back a little bit in the slides to have a look at the question again for question 3. There are some feedback videos based on last week's language analysis task on Fahrenheit 451 for you to check the quality of last week's analysis against. You need to ensure that you use the simplified mark scheme to do your red pen reflections on your language analysis too. Use Q for quotes, D for device, E for effects, and use your red pen to tick where you've met those different criteria. There is another structure analysis question which I will put on the VLE. It's based on Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King. The film is just called The Shawshank Redemption. You might be familiar with it as a man who is falsely imprisoned for murdering his wife. It's a Stephen King novel, very famous film as well. So I want you to find 3 structural devices in that extract and consider why these are chosen, what's the effect on the reader, and as a real challenge for yourself, write up a full answer in time conditions. This will be a 10-minute question. As an extension, particularly if you found that you're a bit rusty on those structural devices, go back to the discussion of those structural devices and make yourself some cue cards. One with the device written on one side, and then on the other side the definition and an example to ensure that you can identify these, because having a really good handle on your terminology is really important for language and for literature, so it will really support you across your whole GCSE study. Okay, well done.